Okay, so now we're going to talk about slavery in this period, but what I'd like to talk about slavery within the context of resistance, and I'm going to talk about it in the United States, but also in Africa as well. Kind of a fairly well, there's some pioneering historians, specifically Dr. Bilal Ware, I believe at UC Santa Barbara, who's done some really great work on this with the Walking Quran. So I'm going to talk about just really kind of illustrate for you all the fact that Africans were not passive in the slave trade. They resisted constantly, hence the brutality of slavery itself. We're going to kind of look at that at various instances of resistance. So let's just look at slavery again. I talked about the dividing line between Maryland and Pennsylvania, the 3630. It's basically demarcated where slavery ended. By the time you get into the early to mid part of the 19th century, it's cotton, which is the major commodity export produced by slave labor. And it had actually in the United States, and we had replaced sugar, right? Violent, resistant, and insurgent activities characterize resistance to slavery. In the Caribbean, since the first importation of enslaved people, there were maroon communities, as well as in Brazil and other parts of the Americas. Maroon communities were escaped Africans who made their way into the forest or whatever and set up communities and often raided plantations and freed fellow enslaved Africans, killed slave owners and just kind of wreaked havoc as much as they could on the plantation economic system. In North America, particularly in the United States, maroon communities were seldom called that. They were called just bands of runaways and truants. There was a great fear of these kind of communities and the examples they set, particularly in light of what had happened in Haiti. Florida is the one state I described earlier that was a hotbed of maroonage, and this was well known amongst enslaved Africans who often tried to flee to Florida, especially during the Spanish period. So I want to talk about African American women. And again, this is very brutal kind of, just intensely disturbing aspect of kind of the Southern economy is that African American women not only perform the same backbreaking labor as men, they were also constantly subjected to rape and sexual abuse. Not only that, Black women's sexual and reproductive capacity were appropriated for economic purposes by slave owners. Um, for selling Black women fixed higher prices than men. The sale of their offspring. Black women were forced to reproduce, right, in order to produce children who could then be enslaved and sold as capital. And again, the commodification of themselves, the reproductive system, and their children. Often, particularly in Louisiana, you had individuals who would purchase enslaved African women and force them to work in brothels. African American women and girls were given away as gifts. In fact, this is how Sally Hemings came to be owned by Thomas Jefferson. The father of his wife gave this child to him, and it's suspected that it was his own child. So this is a very, from back of a better word, I would say bizarre and unnatural sort of enterprise. One of the ideas that's produced, a legal concept that's produced in the slavery states and in law, in fact, in the colonies and then in the United States was the idea of partus sequitur venturum. It's a Latin term that says the child follows the mother. And that was a legal principle that meant that the child who is born follows the status of its mother. If the mother is enslaved, then the child is a slave. It doesn't matter who the father is. In fact, for Black women, legally, there was no father, right? Legally. And in this way, right, slave owners could use Black women to reproduce the so-called product, right? Again, this commodification of human beings, right? And also could escape responsibility, legal responsibility for their offspring. Thomas Jefferson refers to this as sustained and increased capital, right? And heartily recommended it. But Black women, enslaved African women really become a foundation of the Southern economy during this period. So here's a direct quote from Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, who says, quote, "I consider a slave who brings a child every 2 years is more profitable than the best man on the farm, what she produces in addition to capital," right? So he very enthusiastically participated in this, as we talked about earlier, when he begins the sexual abuse of a 13-year-old girl that basically goes on for the rest of her life. This was quite common in um, in enslaved societies and on the plantations. And one of the things about this that I want to kind of mention is in 1808, there's a prohibition on further importation of enslaved Africans into the United States. So what happens is the market value of those enslaved Africans here increases exponentially. So what slave owners begin to do, and Thomas Jefferson specifically instructed his overseers to do this, is to ensure that enslaved women were impregnated and had a child every 2 years, right? In order to increase the capital, increase the bottom line of the plantation owners. Now, as I said, slavery was characterized by rebellion. Haitians, in particular, a combination coalition of free blacks, enslaved blacks, and free people of color, basically not only took the island of Haiti, not only beat back the British, the Spanish, and then the French, all of whom tried to reconquer the island. Eventually, they decide to massacre every French Haitian, every white French Haitian on the island in order to forestall attempts at counter-revolution or them aiding invading armies as they had done every time there'd been an attempt at reconquering the island. Of course, these people flee in large numbers. Many come to the Louisiana territories in the American South. Many end up in South Carolina. They bring with them this fear of slave uprisings and kind of, again, a very sensationalist and graphic narrative of what happened, which is often quite accurate. And they were very much in favor of not getting rid of slavery, but kind of being even more harsh in the system of slavery in terms of policing and controlling slave population, because they have this historical memory, particularly of free people, free blacks, who just ally themselves with enslaved blacks and rise up and kind of you know, wiped them out and drove them off the island. And frankly, slave owners were probably accurate and correct to fear African American revolts. They're a fact of life in the plantation societies because, again, and Africans were not willing to be enslaved in this very brutal system. The thing with revolts, though, is that they contradicted the ideology of race and slavery as whites preached, quite ceaselessly that slavery was a proper and natural place of Africans. By Africans revolting, they kind of, jar that narrative. So an example again of Africans pushing back, Denmark Vesey in June of 1822 inspires a conspiracy in Charleston, South Carolina, to stage an uprising and begin an Haitian Revolution style uprising in the Deep South. Denmark Vesey was a freeman. He had his own business in Charleston. He traveled on ships all over the world, had been on slave ships before, working as a guide and as a sailor. He preached a kind of black nationalism, an early version of it, well before its time, before I think that was even articulated. He basically began recruiting people for his venture. The 10 of his closest recruits had been born in Africa, and this was a very varied very varied and very diverse group of individuals, as some were born in Africa, some had been born in the Caribbean, some had been born there in South Carolina. The ones from Africa they were Igbo, they were Yoruba, they were Hausa, they were Muslim, they were Christian, they were either traditional Angolan and Igbo faiths as well. So his group, he kind of has this church, the AME Church, which is an African Methodist Episcopal Church, started by African Americans in Philadelphia. And in that church, he's stockpiling weapons, he's holding these meetings, he's preaching this notion of Africans kind of uniting, but also pushing back against slavery. So the AME Zion Church basically had been established in around 1816 in Philadelphia. It began as part of a white Methodist congregation, but they wanted independence from the white Methodists, who were often quite racist and marginalized them to a great deal. This church spreads all over the nation. It's still around to this day. Placed a strong emphasis on education, and abolition was their issue. Um, Whites tended to fear and dislike African American interpretations and representations of spirituality, even Christianity, despite the fact that whites had forced these Africans into that religion, sometimes generations prior to this. Um, Europeans had hoped to use Christianity as a mode of social and psychological control, but enslaved Africans, even the ones who weren't particularly literate, but especially those who are literate, tended to flip that on its head. And it's not difficult to understand how that could be done by reading parts of the Old and the New Testament. The AME Church was a kind of revolutionary Christianity. They used the Bible as a narrative of emancipation. And whites tended to not be fond of Africans engaging in this kind of independent and autonomous interpretation of Christian doctrine. So Denmark Vesey again plans and conspires with his lieutenants. The plan was again to rise up and just attack the white community, take control of Charleston, and again spread the revolution all throughout the South. But he's betrayed by other black freemen. He and 75 of his followers are executed, and the church itself is burnt to the ground at the end of June of 1822. It's actually rebuilt in 1865. Just a little bit of recent history. In 2015, it was the site of a mass murder by a white supremacist who went in there and slaughtered several people who were involved in a Bible study. But again, Denmark Vesey is a very kind of a very clear example, right, of African people pushing back against slavery. David Walker is another example. There's been revolts and individual acts of resistance, probably thousands. Walker engages in a kind of what we call secondary resistance, meaning he used the language and the religion of the oppressor against them. He provides a narrative structure to resistance based in spiritual language and calls out Christians for what he calls their hypocrisy in a really big way. He has his catalog. His appeal has catalogs of the crimes committed against Africans by Europeans and whites. He quotes from the Declaration of Independence. He kind of slightly attempts to appeal to the conscience of whites. What he's really doing is talking to the African diaspora in the Africas who were enslaved and who are free. He promises God's wrath, and the wrath of Black people will come down upon white people if they do not repent and end slavery. And again, he's kind of building upon the tradition of a very Christian church-based resistance in the United States, right, from African Americans against slavery. This is kind of what we see with Denmark Vesey. Southern plantation owners were very disturbed by his publication, and about 3 months after it, he actually ends up being poisoned, right? But again, what's super important about him is he's giving this narrative structure, right? He's making a very explicit and articulate argument, framing it, right, in spiritual language of the oppressor, right? And talking about the threat of violent retribution, right? And this is kind of, I won't say it begins, it really strengthens, right, church-based resistance, right, to slavery. And as we get into the Civil War, we're going to find that most abolitionists are very Christian people, as we will see with the modern civil rights movement, which is going to begin in the church, the Black church as well. Nat Turner, probably the most infamous of these rebellions, because it's not stopped. It starts. Unlike Denmark Vesey, his was stopped before it even starts. Nat Turner in 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia, was basically a layman preacher who was recognized by other enslaved people as an authority on the Bible and on Christianity. Believed God was speaking to him. and saw himself as the wrath of the biblical God, of the living God, right? And he gathered together followers who would go out throughout the county, killing planters and their families, killed about 60 white people before eventually he's captured and he's executed. The response by the state of Virginia is not to like loosen up slavery, and that's kind of the pattern you're going to see. This doesn't cause slavers to rethink slavery. In fact, it causes them to clamp down harder because slavery is making them extremely wealthy, right? So in Virginia, 1832, they passed a law that prohibited African American preachers. They strengthened the state militia. They banned free Africans from owning guns. And most importantly, they prohibited anyone from teaching enslaved Africans how to read. This becomes a crime which was sternly punished. African Americans, from the very beginning of enslavement, they would have these secret kind of underground circles within the community teaching each other how to read. So literacy was super important to them when they were enslaved. Slave patrols made up the state militias. Their job was to check the papers of African Americans that they found on the road. If they were enslaved, they had to have their papers on them, who owned them, and also a letter from their owner giving them permission to be on the road. They would break up so-called suspicious gatherings and raided locations looking for weapons. And they were authorized with absolute power to kill anyone who resisted as long as they were Black, whether they were free or enslaved. And they kind of had ultimate authority over all Black people. They were organized by county. And again, these slave patrols, they would capture escaped enslaved people. They would destroy maroon communities. They'd put down slave revolts. They become the foundation for basically the police departments, law enforcement, and the penal systems after the Civil War. And we'll talk about that towards the end of this of this particular series of lectures. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act gave wide latitude to slave owners to even cross state lines. And even cops couldn't even do that back then, right? But slave owners could in order to get their runaway slaves back. It also prohibited anyone from aiding enslaved Africans in their escape. So let's talk a little bit about minstrelsy and again, the appropriation of African American culture. Minstrelsy formerly begins in 1830s. It's known as blackface, begins in Kentucky. It becomes this popular mode of entertainment based upon the myth of the happy-go-lucky childlike slave. And two characters, Jim Crow and Zip Coon, are basically invented by these so-called entertainers, these white men who are entertainers to entertain white crowds. There was a white entertainer by the name of Daddy Rice who borrowed the clothes of an enslaved person and would do an act mimicking African American music and dance. And it was common practice for white entertainers. It becomes common practice for white entertainers to create sheet music of songs that they heard African Americans singing while they're in the field. African American entertainers in the early 19th century were common. They sang and played instruments for white audiences. Often they were enslaved and they were doing that for their owners. But Daddy Rice figured out how to take these songs to wider audiences and made minstrelsy very popular. Basically, minstrelsy kind of reinforced stereotypes and particular racial narratives that whites wanted to believe, right? And that were comforting the white people, especially comforting the slave owners, portraying blacks as clownish, lazy, buffoonish, childlike, incompetent, right? Not holding grudges, loving white people, loving being enslaved, right? And so this reinforced this notion that Black people were better off and their natural state was enslaved, which is what white Southerners are really preaching in a very big way. But despite this racist trope, Africans do create what will become popular music, and we'll talk to that, and all kinds of music forms in the United States. Minstrelsy, again, reinforced racist ideas. A lot of minstrelsy, and it was in the North too, mocked free Blacks. There was a large community of free Black people in Philadelphia. These satiric cartoons were very popular in the North, showing free Blacks as clumsily trying to parrot white civilization and failing at it. African American progress and demonstrations of civility are going to be hotly contested, confronted, and attacked throughout US history because they display a philosophical challenge to the efficacy of white supremacy, produces a kind of cognitive dissonance, which produces anger and mockery and violence, right? Seeing Black people in real time not living up to the racist stereotypical expectations of white races would often drive white people into a kind of violent rage. We'll talk more about that later on. The Mummers Parade, I just want to mention that is a tradition that began in early 19th century Philadelphia, not in the South, where Philadelphia white men would dress up in blackface and hold parades, right? So again, this becomes almost it's like hardwired into the kind of entertainment culture of white people, right? In order to again reinforce these racist beliefs that they wanted to feel comfortable holding. So Stephen Foster is the first of many artists who will become quite enamored of African produced music. And it's written that he wanted to humanize the Black characters in his song, but again, he's really viewing them through the lens of a 19th century racist white man, right? He appropriated so-called Negro songs, and these were, again, songs that he heard enslaved Africans singing in the field. Then he put them to music and sold the sheet music. He made tens of thousands of dollars. Some examples are Old Kentucky Home, Oh Susanna, Camptown Races, Oh Black Joe. There's a lot of these kind of songs that you may or may not have heard of that again he got quite wealthy making sheet music and selling them. These are two versions of the same song, one very racist and one more probably closer to the tradition of how African Americans sang it. Just to give you an idea of the difference between appropriation and just kind of partaking in a universal language of music and artistic expression. Now, a great example of autonomous cultural production by African Americans, which ultimately will lead to, again, modern American music, is Congo Square in New Orleans from the 18th through the 20th century. In New Orleans, in the early 18th century, during the French and Spanish periods, enslaved Africans from many nations, Caribbeans, enslaved Africans who come from up, been sold from up north, they could gather every Sunday at this particular area that was nicknamed Congo Square, and they'd play drums and they'd play semi-traditional music, Caribbean music, and they'd incorporate Western basic brass instruments. And so this kind of artistic hybridization and creativity basically produces what later on will become jazz. Because this is kind of this safe, autonomous cultural space. Every Sunday, the tradition for the slave owners to allow this, where again they would engage in this. So despite the utter destruction and transformation of sub-Saharan Africa due to the transatlantic slave trade, there were indigenous African movements that did in fact oppose the trade. Now, I want to give credit to my source, really, who's Dr. Bilal Ware, with his book, The Walking Quran. He's done some amazing, groundbreaking research on this that many other historians have not done, really from the African point of view, in terms of how they dealt with the slave trade, this kind of internal resistance to transatlantic slave trade. Again, this is just one of many instances, but the research is not plentiful, but again, it's just kind of starting to be out there, right? So the Senegambia region is where many African Americans can trace their ancestry. It's the location of modern-day Senegal and Gambia. Resistance to slavery there emerged from an African Islamic cultural and spiritual context. Dr. Ware, in his text, The Walking Quran, recounts the narrative of Cherno Suleiman, who was a Fulbe Islamic scholar, who basically raises an army and launches jihad against the transatlantic slave trade, or the use of the selling of enslaved Africans to Europeans, right? The story said he frees a man when he hears him chained up in a boat chanting the Quran. And again, he gains popularity after he wanders the region, giving sermons condemning the sale of fellow Muslims to the Europeans as slaves. He gains popularity, raises up an army, and begins to wage jihad against the slavers, who are mostly primarily the French. And again, and also wages it against those rulers, those African rulers who are in league with the Europeans and engage in as allies, kind of selling other Africans to the French. He's killed in 1776. However, another individual, another also a scholar and a Quranic reciter by the name of Abdul Qadir Khan, also begins the jihad in that same year, carrying on in the tradition of Cherno. So Cherno Suleiman really has awakened this particular spirit of resistance grounded in Islamic principle, right? And Abdul Qadir Khan not only fought to end the enslavement of his fellow Muslim Africans, he blocked Europeans from the Gambian River and the region for many years. And he actually would free any person who could recite even one verse of the Quran. So all they had to do was be able to say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and he would free them. He emancipated thousands of African people, again, blocked, abolished the slave trade in the Senegambia Valley, until he was killed in 1806. Now, of course, the European response, again, and this is mostly the French we're talking about, was to arm other factions against him and flood the continent with weapons and capital. Again, they're just trying to get as many bodies as they could. The political economy of the continent had been so altered by the transatlantic slave trade, it was almost impossible at the height of this trade to stop the trafficking of captives. One of the things that happened with the transatlantic slave trade, and this is where you get the narrative, particularly from racist people who like to blame the transatlantic slave trade on other Africans by saying, well, it was other Africans selling other Africans. They're correct that that was the case, but the dynamic was this, that the British would come in and they would arm a particular faction or an ethnic group and say, we will continue to give you arms, muskets, powder, etc., in exchange for bodies, for human beings, for captives. We're not going to accept gold. We're not going to accept diamonds. We're not going to accept anything. We want people, right? And so those people would go out and they would capture other Africans, usually outside of their ethnic group, sell them to the British. Now, the French would go to those people who were being rode on and they say, we will give you weapons in order to defend yourself against those people, but you must pay us in bodies. So in this way, the Europeans begin these massive arms race all along the West African coast, and they create conditions where if you want to survive, you have to have access to those Western weapons. And in order to do that, you have to sell your fellow Africans, right? And this is not to justify it, it's just to explain the dynamic and lay it at the feet of the Europeans, who were, again, bringing millions of people out of the continent and enslaving them in the Americas. So with Abdul Qadir Khan's death, this does end. Even his sons apparently didn't really respect his attempts to stop slavery. Europeans are able to restore economic hegemony. Again, despite this kind of grassroots resistance, slavery persists. Now, eventually the French are going to turn towards abolition and use, as will the British, and they're going to use it as a pretext to invade and occupy Senegambia, which is divided between them and the British. Ahmadu Bambo, this interesting figure from the latter part of the 19th century, kind of returns to the traditions, the tradition of scholars avoiding sitting with leaders, especially corrupt leaders, and avoiding the company of powerful men. He engages in a particular kind of spiritual resistance, and to this day, his tariqa is very much alive, very, very active in Senegal. But the continent is, in fact, devastated by the transatlantic slave trade. And again, this weakening of African societies eventually will make them ripe for colonization. Again, the irony being the pretext for colonization was often citing, we're going to stop the slave trade. And because the history is kind of written by Europeans and the sources used are from Europeans, much blame as possible is shifted to Arabs and Africans, rather than the people who are really making the millions of dollars on this and then benefit by colonization, that being the Europeans. Indigenous abolition movements are not part of the historiography, unfortunately. I think they will become more a part of it as more historians kind of look at the records in Africa and what Africans are saying and look more closely even at some of the European archives. So in conclusion, Africans resisted slavery in Africa, in the Americas. There was armed resistance, there was spiritual resistance, there was rhetorical and literary resistance, right? Even running away is an act of resistance. The Haitian Revolution was well known amongst enslaved Africans, it was a powerful symbol that terrified whites, and it really encouraged and raised up the hopes of enslaved Africans. White slave owners responded to instances of resistance with extreme violence and brutality, again, hoping to terrify Africans into passivity. And this was never successful. But hence the slave patrols and state-sanctioned kind of terrorism writ large throughout slave-holding territories was what they tried to do to hold on to the institution as long as they could. Spanish Florida, another example of resistance. And you have primary and secondary resistance. So Denmark Vesey, David Walker, this is secondary resistance. They're using the language, the traditions, right? The cultural framework of the oppressor to argue against slavery. And maybe not as much Denmark Vesey, but definitely David Walker, right? But you have instances, of course, in Africa. And then, of course, the Bahia slave revolts, which Sheikh Muhammad Sharif has written quite extensively about those. These are examples of primary resistance, right? Where enslaved Africans are using the indigenous culture and spiritual traditions of their own indigenous traditions in order to frame their resistance. Again, the responses of whites are, again, quite brutal in the United States as well as Europeans in Africa.